This is a Trident Disabilities audio archive recording. Troubled Waters, Reading Urine in Medieval Medicine by Catherine Harvey, published April 19, 2023. From cabbage green to coarse meal, medieval manuscripts exhibit a spectrum of colors and consistencies when describing urine. Catherine Harvey examines the complex practices of uroscopy, how physicians could divine sexual history, disease, and impending death by studying the body's liquid excretions. Below this is a woodcut uroscopy chart pairing urine flasks with color descriptions printed at the private press of Ulrich Pender, physician to the city of Nuremberg from 1506, featuring one person sitting in a chair holding a urine sample and the other one examining it, with a circle around with each color. In the mid-13th century, William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan friar, traveled to the Mongol Empire. The main purpose of his visit was to undertake missionary work, but he also wrote a colorful account of his travels for King Louis XI of France, in which he described the region and its inhabitants. Among his many curious observations, he was astonished to find that the local physicians, who were generally skilled and knowledgeable, did not examine their patients' urine. To the modern reader, this may seem an odd detail to highlight, but William came from a world in which uroscopy, the examination of urine for the purpose of diagnosis and prognosis, was one of a doctor's most valued skills. The link was so strong that the urine flask became an identifying symbol of the late medieval physician, who was often shown examining a symbol. The symbol was used both to celebrate illustrious figures such as Saint Cosmos, the patron saint of medicine, and to punish charlatans like Roger Clerk of Wandsworth, who in 1382 was found guilty of selling useless cures to the poor, despite having no medical knowledge or training. He was led to the pillory on a saddleless horse, a urinal being hung before him, and another urinal on his back, in mockery of his malpractice. Satirists jeered at practitioners for their obsession with such unsavory matters. Petrarch memorably claimed that the pagan physicians were pale and emancipated because they rummaged around in sloshing chamber pots. In comic images of monkey physicians examining urine flasks are both found in manuscript marginalia and in early 14th century stained glass at York Minster. Medieval physicians were interested in their patients' urine because it provided immediate insight into the humoral state of the body. Before William Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood in the 17th century, physicians believed that the principal purpose of digestion was to convert food into blood, which was constantly being used up, and thus had to be replenished every night while the patient slept. Digestion was a complex multi-stage process, and it led to various waste products like urine, which bore traces of the organs involved in its production, including the stomach, intestines, liver, and kidneys. Consequently, if the body was too hot or too cold, or if its humors were out of balance, this would be apparent from the urine it produced. Below this is two images, the first one including a sick patient in bed in his room, and two examiners, one of which is holding up a urine sample, and the other one is looking at the others at a desk. The caption for this reads, "Woodcut of a physician examining the causes and signs of disease, holding a urine flask up to the light," from a Spanish manuscript of Bartholomew Angelicus. The other image includes two sides, one each holding a physician holding up a urine sample and peering inside. The caption for this reads, "Woodcuts from the workshop of Michael Waldmanut," depicting physicians examining urine from 1493, used in various manuscripts of the Nuremberg Chronicle. Uroscopy is a very old practice, dating back at least as far as the ancient Babylonians, and was widely discussed by the classical authorities whose writing formed the basis of such medieval medical practice. The Hippocratic aphorisms include advice on urine-based diagnosis and prognosis. For example, colorless urine is bad. It is especially common in those with diseases on the brain, and the presence of particles like coarse meal in the urine of patients with fevers signifies a long illness. Over the centuries, a substantial literature on the subject accumulated in the Artilocella, a collection of treatises that formed the basis of university medical education in the later Middle Ages, included Isaac Judaeus' Liber Urinarium, written in the 9th century, and De Urinis by Giles of Corbel, from 1140 to 1220. Since uroscopy lent itself to diagrammic representation, practicing physicians often used illustrated guides, such as text, to survive sufficient numbers to suggest that they were widely employed working tools in later medieval Europe. A particularly fine example is found in Bodleian Library, which includes a late 14th century ring diagram, to complete with 20 labeled flasks, their colors ranging from white to black. The flasks are grouped according to meaning. 4 reddish gold samples, for example, signify good digestion, whilst 3 flags of very dark liquid suggest death. Some authors are quite imaginative in their description of the colors. In late 15th century miscellany, one example is described as being green like cabbage. Another widely circulated treatise described a type of black urine that is caused by mortification. And that type of blackness is most like a polished black horn, or like a raven's feather, or like a man from Ethiopia. Such comparisons to familiar sights were probably intended to help practitioners distinguish between very similar colors, and to compensate for the shortcomings of the diagram, the decoration of which sometimes owed more to the availability of pigments than to scientific accuracy. Below this is 2 images, the first one being a medieval ring diagram with urine flasks from 1387 to 1400. Below this is a page from a book featuring 2 sides showing another urine diagram with colors, and that says, Pages on Interpreting of the Colors of Urine from Sloane 1313, a Latin and French medical miscellany, from 1500 to 1600. Many treatises suggested that it was possible to identify several layers to the urine, and which meant that some diagrams showed examples with very distinctive and surely exaggerated color differences, red with a mint green layer on top, or olive green with an orangish ring. If the top layer was particularly large, it might signify head pain. If it was very foamy, that indicated gasiness boiling into the urinary vessels or distension of some other disorder of the lung. The middle region should be examined for cloudiness, which could be a good or bad sign depending on the condition from which the patient was suffering. It was at the bottom of the example that one of the most likely to see sediments, although these might be suspended in the urine. Some texts place particular emphasis on things found in urine. In this pair of flasks from an early 15th century medical miscellany, we can see blood in one sample and particles suspended in the other. The caption reads and explains the meaning of these worrying features. Blood in the urine indicates a broken vein at the back of the head, and gravel betokeneth ache and spite of the stone in the reins, that is, kidney stones. Below this is an example of those 2, the flask on the right being bloody and red with specks in it, and the one on the left having red dots at the bottom and particles floating on the top with a regular grayish yellow. To interpret all these signs correctly, the skilled physician would not simply match the sample to the color swath. Rather, he would combine his observations with his own extensive knowledge, both theoretical and practical, in order to identify what ailed his patient and determine the likely progression of his or her disease. Surprisingly often, this was done remotely. Such was the trust in this method that many patients simply sent a sample to the doctor, who examined it and sent his verdict back. In 1334, the Aragonese towns of Vic and Montcada agreed to share a municipal physician, even though they are some 60 kilometers apart. The man appointed, Ramon Arty, was to live in Vic, but to interpret urines brought to him from either town. Far from being a strategy restricted to those who could not afford to see a doctor, this form of consultation was used even by the wealthiest members of society, such as Agnes, Lady Stonor, who in 1480 sent here water unto M. Derworth to understand his conceit, and how he dimmeth by his water, whether she be of way the mending. His verdict is not recorded, but she died in the following year. Not everyone thought that this was a good idea. Isaac Judaeus, author of one of the most authoritative uroscopy treatises, criticized fools who would base prophecies on it, without seeing the patient and determine what disease is present, and whether the patient will die, and other foolishness. Anyone who did consult in this way should explain as much contextual information as possible to avoid falling in the same track as the eminent Parisian physician, Guillaume Boucher, who died in 1480. He examined the sample and confidently announced that it belonged to a man with stomach problems. The couriers burst out laughing because it was produced by a woman. Partly motivated by desire to avoid such humiliation, university-educated physicians increasingly argued that bedside medicine was the best form of treatment. It allowed the practitioner to conduct a physical examination, considering other important signs, such as pulse, and scrutinizing other extracta, such as sweat and feces, and to interrogate the patient about his symptoms. Bedside medicine also allowed the physician to assert authority by showing off his knowledge and skills, something which more were very keen to do, in order to prove their superiority over many rivals in the medical marketplace. Examining a urine sample in the presence of the patient who produced it, plus his family, friends, or servants, would be a particularly effective way to do this, as the process was straightforward but impressive. Ideally, the sample was collected in the morning after the patient had slept and before he drank anything, and then allowed to settle for several hours. During this time, it must not be exposed to direct sunlight or excessive heat, which might change its composition. The physician's inspection typically took place towards the end of his visit, and he often made a performance of it, holding the flask up to the light and scrutinizing it at length. One 12th century manual suggested that while you look at the urine for a long time, you may pay attention to its color, substance, and quantity to it, and to its contents, from the diversity of which you will diagnose the different kinds of diseases, whereupon you promise health to the patient who is hanging on your lips. Below this is 2 images, the first one being one long detail from a French miniature depicting scenes of a medical consultation, including a physician examining a urine flask, in the top right image. There is a total of 6 images, and the first one being the medical examiner examining the patient in different ways, going on to the second one, the 4th image, 5th image, and including the 6th image as well. Below this, the other image includes a woodcut uroscopy diagnostic chart on the left, printed at a private press of Ulrich Pinder, physician of city of Nuremberg, from 1506, and on the right is an elongated version of that in a different form, on a page format. A skilled physician could identify a whole range of conditions based on a urine sample. According to Giles of Corbill's influence treatise, pure and unclotted blood in the urine indicated a problem with the kidneys, especially if it was accompanied by pain. Lividity coupled with minute, distinct particles consistently indicates respiratory trouble, and gout was revealed by tiny white flecks. Urine was a particularly useful tool for diagnosing leprosy, because the immediate physiological cause was thought to be a malfunctioning liver, an organ which was central to the digestive process, and thus any problems would be visible in the urine. In 1456, when Richard Walsham, a monk of Norwich Cathedral Priory, was suspected of contracting leprosy, the prior had several physicians examine his body and urine in order to confirm that he was not afflicted. Medieval people also believed that uroscopy could reveal when an individual would die, allowing him to use his final days wisely. After William the Conqueror fell from his horse in 1087, he suffered agonizing internal agonies. According to the chronicler William of Malmesbury, from 1090 to 1143, his physicians inspected his urine and foretold certain death, which allowed him to receive the last rites and put his affairs in order. In 1214, suspecting that he was fatally ill, Abbot John of St. Albans examined his own urine for the small hidden marks which he knew would be signs of death, and correctly predicted that he only had 3 days left to live. The abbey's chronicler admirably noted that, being very experienced in the art of medicine, John had made often similar infallible predictions about others. Below this is an example of an illustration of the miniature depicting the bedridden John, Duke of Normandy, and his physicians examining his urine from 1380 to 1400. There are 3 physicians examining the urine crowding around his bed, while John lays in his dark bed, sulking with his eyes nearly closed. Urine predicted the end of life, but it could also be used to track its conception through fertility testing. The Trotula, an influential compendium of women's medicine, recommended that both husband and wife should urinate in a pot of bran. If, after 10 days, either pot was stinking and full of worms, that indicated which spouse was infertile. According to the Dome of Urine, a widely circulated Middle English compendium of uroscopic tests, it was possible to know whether a woman had conceived immediately after intercourse. If her urine was clear, then she was pregnant, and if it was thick, she was not. A few months on, the sex of the child could be determined by the cloudiness of the mother's urine, whilst lead-colored urine suggested a miscarriage. But not all physicians were willing to pronounce on such matters. A wise one would refuse to do so if he suspected that a female patient was intending to procure an abortion. Urine could be used to uncover an individual's sexual history. The water of a constant virgin would be wan and extremely calm, and pass in a slow, delicate fashion because the passages of the womb and vulva were narrow. It was evidently common to conflate the urinary passage and vagina. On the other hand, thick urine of a woman declares her to be corrupt. Men's urine could be equally revealing, as seed in the bottom of the flask proved that the provider recently had sex. In the mid-12th century, shortly after taking his third wife, Ralph, Count of Vermandois, became seriously ill, and his doctor told him to abstain from marital relations. But when the physician examined the Count's urine, he realized that his advice had been ignored, and correctly predicted that Ralph would be dead within 3 days. Count Ralph's unfortunate demise highlighted another potential problem with uroscopy: patients who ignored or mistrusted their doctors. Some went so far as to test the skills of their chosen practitioner. Although Arabic medical authorities such as Rhazes and Avicenna, both of whom were widely read and highly respected in the medieval West, recommended it, European physicians rarely smelled or tasted urine for medical reasons. Even so, they might be well advised to give it a discreet sniff, since cynical patients sometimes provided examples of white wine or other yellowish liquids. In one extreme case from around the year 1000, a Duke of Bavaria began his consultation with the famous monk physician Notker by sending him a urine sample provided not by the Duke but by a pregnant servant girl. On examining it, Notker fell to his knees, praising God and declaring, "Within the week the Lord will perform an unheard of miracle. The Duke will give birth to his son." Shortly after, the maid produced a baby boy, and the Duke sent his messengers back to Notker with a sample of his own. Below this is an illumination of the Parisian physician's Raz practicing uroscopy from a manuscript of Gerard of Cremonia's Recueil des Traités de Médecine from around 1250 to 1260. In theory, patients could also fall victim to urine-related trickery, as it happens in the humorous tale of the Decameron, in which Calandri's team up with the doctor to convince him he is pregnant. But for the most part, the demand and trust in uroscopy was high, because it seemed to offer objective and certain diagnosis for a relatively small cost. In 1315, when John II of Aragon closed a street in Barcelona's Jewish quarter, he exempted the physician vital ruin, because many people had to show him the urines of sick people and ask him for advice for them. Other towns in the region appointed municipal physicians for this purpose. Abraham Descaslar, employed in this capacity by Castella de Impurities in 1316, agreed to look at and assess all the urines brought to me by citizens. Indeed, the demand for uroscopy was too high to be satisfied by university-trained physicians, who were both rare and expensive, and many patients turned to less qualified practitioners. In mid-15th century Essex, John Crophill worked as both a bailiff and a healer. Seemingly self-taught and certainly not university-educated, his commonplace book includes 2 tests on urine, alongside others on subjects such as bloodletting and astrology, plus a list of patients whose urine he had examined and to whom he had provided cures. Across the channel, Jacoba Felice, an unlicensed female practitioner who appeared before the Parisian medical authorities in 1322, offered similar services. Several of her mostly female clientele recalled her continually examining their urine in the manner of physicians and doctors, and reported that she had cured them when male physicians had failed to do so. 18 years earlier, when Gurola de Codines faced a similar hearing in Barcelona, she asserted that she could diagnose a patient's illness from his urine, having been taught to do so by a certain foreign doctor. Clearly, her legal travails did not deter patients, since 3 years later she was back in court claiming that many people consulted her and that her uroscopy skills were especially in demand. Whilst professional trust in uroscopy waned considerably after 1500, partly because of its growing association with such quacks, patients' enthusiasm for this cheap, convenient, and reliable practice remained high. Indeed, although uroscopy no longer serves as an all-purpose diagnostic tool, new forms of urine analysis have developed from these ancient traditions, and our present-day medical landscape is awash with urine samples. Although 21st century patients benefit from relatively recent innovations such as hormone-based pregnancy tests, color is still used to diagnose conditions such as porphyria, whilst blood and/or cloudy urine continues to be recognized as a sign of kidney stones and infections. Although medieval understandings of urine were deeply flawed, the popularity and longevity of urine-based diagnosis reflect an enduring desire on the part of both patients and physicians for reliable tests which provided objective diagnosis, and serve an important reminder that, contrary to popular stereotypes of pre-modern medicine, much of it was rational, methodological, and rooted in science.